I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I want to remind you that I am currently without an advertiser or sponsors, so it is you, the listener, that will help to keep this show healthy and going by donating to the Parallax Views Patreon page at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you're in the mood this holiday season to give back to the program, please, I encourage it. It really helps me out. With that out of the way, we have a returning guest, Dr. Annelle Sheline of the Quincy Institute. She's been on the show before. She's a favorite of mine. And I gotta say, this is the first time I've spoken to her since she resigned from the Biden State Department. So I was very, very excited to speak with her. We talked about the Middle East, focusing on Syria, but also looking at what is happening in Gaza. We talk U.S. foreign policy and a number of other topics. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, for you, the listener. I think you'll find it enlightening. And with that, let's get right to it with Annelle Sheline. Welcome back to Parallax Views. A guest that I was just saying I love having on. She's one of my favorites. Annelle Sheline of the Quincy Institute. How are you doing?
Doing well. Good to be back.
So I initially wanted to have you back on to talk about the changing relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but I feel like we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the overthrow of Assad and what this means for geopolitics in the Middle East. What does it mean for the U.S.? What's your basic analysis?
Yeah, it is very big news. And I think, first of all, I think it's important to start with just acknowledging that this is extremely exciting. I mean, Assad was a brutal dictator. If people can remember the horrors of the Syrian refugee crisis that sent hundreds of thousands of Syrians fleeing both into the rest of the region and into Europe, which had significant effects even on driving political outcomes. Things like Brexit, for example, was certainly exacerbated by concerns about this perceived threat of Syrians who were simply trying to escape the horrors of what Bashar al-Assad's regime was doing to hang on to power. And many countries in the region, including Jordan and Lebanon, still have many numbers of Syrians who have not yet been able to return home. Although, in pictures, we're starting to see Syrians lined up on the border, eager to come back. So, first, just to say that it is exciting that Assad has fallen. At the same time, it is very worrying. This is not only due to the fact that the region itself is already dealing with so much instability, but Syria, although the civil war has been referred to as a frozen conflict for the past few years, where you were not seeing as much active fighting, it had remained, Syria has been struggling immensely. This is largely the result of ongoing violence. We saw Israel, for example, continuing to bomb parts of Syria. We'll talk more about that. But also the massive US sanctions that had been in place, which, although it is understandable that the US government wanted to try to hold Assad accountable for what he had done to his people, in the end, these broad-based sanctions were really harming the Syrian population and were clearly not having an effect on ousting Assad. And, I think people might respond, well, but it worked. Clearly, he's out. And instead, I would argue, as others have, that this was not due to sanctions, which, again, the analysis on sanctions is often that they tend to reinforce the power of those in charge because those are the individuals that have the access to gain the resources that they need while they immiserate the population. And so 90% of Syria's population is now living in poverty as a result of the war and the sanctions. In contrast, the real deciding factor was the fact that the foreign backers of the Assad regime, namely Russia and Iran, are distracted. Obviously, Russia is bogged down and very involved, sending lots of resources to fight the war in Ukraine. And Iran has been dealing with the aftermath of October 7th and efforts and in particular, Israel's invasion of Lebanon on October 1st. We remain at the moment in a tentative ceasefire, Hezbollah and Israel having agreed to the terms of a ceasefire, although both sides have violated that, and Israel in particular has continued to bomb Lebanon. But the point being that neither Tehran nor Moscow had a lot of extra bandwidth to continue to support Assad. And we've heard that. I do think another important factor here, though, is that hasn't necessarily gotten quite as much attention is, it's not as if it's a new circumstance. Russia has been fighting the war in Ukraine since 2022. We've had that, October 7th, 2023, obviously more than a year ago. So what were some of these crucial factors that led to this downfall now? And an important thing to keep in mind is the fact that the Assad regime wasn't necessarily behaving in the way that Iran in particular expected or wanted from a government that it had very directly supported. And in particular, thinking about the moment in 2013 when Hezbollah intervened in Syria to help prop up Assad. That was really a crucial turning point. It's possible Assad's government would have fallen at that time if not for Hezbollah with Iran's blessing. So in contrast to that, instead, we saw the Assad government engaging in outreach to the Sunni Arab regimes. For example, the UAE normalized relations with Assad back in 2018. And this was seen as an attempt by the UAE to try to pull Syria out of Iran's orbit, to try to, this is not the first time the UAE has been willing to be a first mover. We think about things like the Abraham Accords, when the UAE was willing to normalize with Israel, and other countries then followed suit. So a more recent development on that was that the Arab League, all the countries of the Arab League were decided they would reestablish relations and normalize with the Assad regime in 2023.
Yeah, that came as a big surprise to a lot of people, but yeah.
It did. And I think especially in Washington, where you had a widespread perception, especially places like the Office of Human Rights, where I was working in the State Department, Syria very much still seen as a pariah state, a rogue state, engaging in horrific acts of violence, still continue to act, continue. And as we've seen in the footage, these horrifying videos of people that have been rotting in Syrian prisons for decades, long before the 2011 uh, popular uprising, but especially in the aftermath of that as well. Um, so essentially, you there and there's been really good analysis on this from Hassan, for example. If people are interested in following up, there's um, just the ways in which Assad was no longer willing to necessarily do what Iran wanted or to Hezbollah no longer saw it as viable to continue to prop him up. So I do think that it's important to keep that in mind as well, that it seems Assad had grown somewhat arrogant in that he was not only felt that he could count on the support from Iran and Hezbollah, but was establishing these relations with other Sunni Arab regimes. And another just point of context here is in the context of these massive sanctions, the Assad government was keeping itself, continuing to make money through drug production, through the production of Captagon, which is an amphetamine. It's not entirely clear everything that goes into it. There hasn't been, it's clearly not necessarily consistent. But this is a drug that has been showing up across the region, in particular in Gulf countries, and increasingly in Europe. And so I do think there is some question now, what is going to happen in terms of the ongoing manufacture of this drug, and how now HTS and other groups vying for control in Syria may decide to perpetuate the manufacture of this drug and the role, again, that US sanctions could play in that. One last point, I know I've been going on and on. I do think it is important to keep in mind the ways that US sanctions have prevented the development of, well, they've prevented reconstruction in Syria from the war, also the horrific earthquake that happened early in 2023. And they have hollowed out civil society such that although you have an opposition group like HTS taking over, I mean, keeping in mind this is designated as a foreign terrorist organization, the sort of actors within civil society, things like, groups of ordinary unarmed civilians that one would hope would sort of be able to operate, sort of a relatively normal unarmed political opposition. All of that has been decimated in Syria as a result of the repression. And so at this point, you're left with just these often quite extreme militant groups, and that is who is in control, which is part of, again, why we've heard a lot of people, although they're expressing excitement at this outcome, Syria is in a very precarious position.
Can you comment any more on HTS? Because I'm hearing a lot of different viewpoints on HTS and al-Jilani. I'm hearing some people say once a jihadi, always a jihadi. Oh, he's an ultra conservative, but he's moved away from jihadism. I get the impression we don't know yet what HTS is going to do in Syria. What's your view, though?
I think that's accurate, and I in no way want to pretend to be an expert on HTS. Like many people, this was the first I'd heard of them when they suddenly, came out of northwest Syria and started to take territory just in recent weeks. I think that in general, within political science, there's a notion, or there's sort of a theory called the inclusion moderation hypothesis, that if you include more extreme groups in the governing process, you get them invested in its success, and often they are then forced to moderate because they are operating sort of within the system, and so they're now more accountable to different constituencies, and they're also just faced with the realities of governing and having to deliver rather than simply criticizing a system from the outside. So there is evidence in favor of this inclusion moderation hypothesis. And in the case of HTS, I think they have signaled some level of willingness to govern in a manner that would be representative, or at least not directly harmful to groups, like minority groups in Syria. There have certainly been concerns about women's rights. Obviously, under the Ba'athist regime in Syria, Islamist groups were seen as a threat. Baathism is originally was a secular movement. So similar to Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime in Iraq, which Saddam became increasingly religious over time. And so in many ways, Baathism reflected the needs of the leaders at any given moment. But in general, Baathism came out of Arab nationalism, which was a secular movement, which typically found itself or saw itself as being in contrast to Islamist political movements. So in Syria, this does reflect the fact that as a society, you did tend historically under first Hafiz al-Assad and then his son Bashar, while Syria remained a religious society, you certainly would see plenty of women who were not veiled necessarily, especially in major cities like Damascus. So I think there is certainly a question, especially from the population inside Damascus itself, which has, although many people inside Damascus were opposed to the rule of Assad, they have managed to withstand some of the violence that destroyed massive parts of the rest of the country. So I think now you are getting questions from people both inside and outside of Syria of what HTS will mean for women's rights or for sort of the role that women will play in society. But all that to say that, I think certain decisions that other countries make right now could have a significant influence on the decisions that HTS ultimately goes with. And so, for example, if the US signals that they would be willing to engage with this government, especially if they make guarantees for the protection of minority groups, for example, and protections for women's rights, that the U.S. would be willing to engage in normal relations with a new Syrian government.
I wanted to ask in terms of the other players, the other chess players in all of this. I wanted to talk specifically about Turkey and Israel because they're both launching strikes. What do they have to gain in all of this, and what should we be keeping an eye on with these strikes that are happening in Syria from both Turkey and Israel?
Yes. These are crucial questions. Israel has been, and the US as well, has launched within the past few days, I think 75 airstrikes on different sites that were described as ISIS sites. But at the same time, I haven't yet seen any evidence of the death toll of civilians that may have been killed by that. Israel last night destroyed Syria's navy and has already engaged in a land grab, seizing more territory in and around the Golan Heights, which Israel had held illegally, held as occupied territory since 1967. And then under the Trump administration, the US recognized Israel's claim to the Golan Heights, which again, according to the UN, remained occupied territory like the occupied Palestinian territories. And Israel is now seizing additional land. I think Israel's behavior is quite interesting because although rhetorically you saw Syria both portrayed and portraying itself as a member of the axis of resistance, opposed to Israel, opposed to US hegemony, military hegemony in the Middle East. And yet at the same time, we're now seeing documents coming out. We're seeing reports of the fact that Israel and Assad were quite willing to coexist side by side. Israel shares a border with Syria. And given the way that Israel is reacting now, with the level of airstrikes and violence that Syria is carrying out, it's clear that Syria did not really consider Assad a threat and is
You
now.
meant Israel didn't consider Assad a threat. You
Yes.
said
Oh, sorry.
Syria. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
clear that Israel did not consider Assad a significant threat and that they had established a certain modus vivendi, that they were willing to coexist side by side. In
I was
contrast,
going to say in that regard, not to interrupt you, but in some ways it feels like maybe Israel would have preferred a weak Assad to a wild card like HTS.
certainly, absolutely. And in general, we know that Israel is one of the main backers of autocracy in the region. You know, they prefer Arab autocrats who are willing to at least coexist, if not perhaps normalize, with Israel over the objections of their own population because of the ways that the US incentivizes these normalizations or this coexistence with Israel. Whereas if you had democracy in these countries, you would likely see different policies towards Israel. Not to say that these countries would want to wipe Israel off the map, but I think you would see a lot more pressure on Israel to recognize the state of Palestine. Whereas Turkey is a different factor here. So HTS had and has Turkish backing. You saw Turkey in general, you know, the Turkish interest in Syria is tied to the presence of the Kurds
In northern Syria. Yeah.
in northern Syria, and especially northeast Syria is where sort of Kurdish-held areas that had made Turkey feel alarmed, given that Turkey resists the irredentist claims of its own Kurdish population. It sees both the presence of Kurds and the autonomous Kurdish region in Iraq as threatening to the status quo and the relative autonomy of Kurds in northern Syria. And so we did see Turkey. I saw reports of drones that had, I think, killed, I believe, 11 civilians in a Kurdish-held area as of just a few days ago. I would not be surprised if there have been additional acts of violence. But in general, Turkey had not been Turkey's interest is primarily tied to the issue of the Kurdish people and its concerns about the possible establishment of a state of Kurdistan.
In terms of, you mentioned the axis of resistance. A lot of people are hailing this as well, I guess it is the death of the axis of resistance. But do you think people have gotten their analysis wrong on some of the talk of the axis of resistance over the years? What I mean by that is it's not like, the Middle East version of NATO. It was always a very loose coalition. And I think sometimes this whole axis of resistance thing was talked about in a very sensational and over the top way.
I would definitely agree with that. In particular, the ways that these various members of the Axis have been characterized as Iranian proxies, and the implication of that being that Iran controls them, or furthermore, that they wouldn't exist without Iranian support. And, so you think of something like the Assad regime in Syria, which predated the establishment of the Islamic State of Iran. You think about the creation of Hezbollah, which is in direct reaction to Israel's occupation of Lebanon in the 80s. You think about the Houthis or Ansar Allah in Yemen, which originally came about as a result of Saudi efforts to proselytize Wahhabi Sunnism in northern Yemen, an area that has been historically a Zaydi Shia area. And so originally the Houthis were a youth movement that were just concerned about efforts to sort of dilute or change their existing Zaydi Shia culture. And I just emphasize the difference because Zaydi Shiism is its own thing, distinct from the form of Shiism practiced in Iran and elsewhere. So, in general, I think that while these are all groups that Iran found it beneficial to work with and to send resources to, they have their own agendas. They would exist even if Iran suddenly ceased to exist. The circumstances that brought about the creation of these groups would not change. And so, I think that it has certainly served American purposes, the purposes of an American foreign policy establishment and an American military, that finds it useful to reify this notion of a Shia crescent or this axis of resistance to further justify large amounts of spending, military intervention, a big military footprint, this perceived need for the U.S. to push back against this, um, this so-called threat in the region.
I think it's also led to people getting things wrong. I mean, for instance, Hamas hasn't always been on the same side as Iran when it came to Syria and Assad. And even now we're seeing Hamas's statement right after the fall of Assad, um, congratulating the Syrian people. So I think sometimes the way we talk about, quote unquote, Iranian proxies has actually been unhelpful to making accurate analysis.
Absolutely. And I'm reminded of the Cold War when you had efforts to sort of categorize a various government or country as either, capitalist or communist or, in the US camp or the Soviet camp. And yet, you know, often the circumstances on the ground, as I was saying, sort of reflected the existing conditions. And so, although it could be useful for a government or for an opposition group to appeal to the two major superpowers, saying, "Hey, send us weapons, send us resources, and we'll fight on your team." Those groups and those conditions predated and sort of exist separately from the big great power competition.
Yeah, and I mean, there were even countries that were, legitimately non-aligned that sometimes would gain the ire of the US for being non-aligned because of the paranoia of, oh, they're really secret communists or.
Right, that as well, right. And increasingly we're seeing this dynamic playing out, especially in East Asia, but also across the Middle East, in Europe, where the US is so paranoid about this creeping influence of China. This was certainly something I observed at the State Department, where a big talking point for a meeting with a foreign official from the Middle East would be concerns that the country might decide to invest in 5G from Huawei, because it was the cheapest, best option. And this was seen as, this was like the top issue item on the agenda, which, I mean, just demonstrates the extent to which this sort of great power competition framework has reemerged. And in many ways, I do think, in part because it reflects the sort of comfort zone of cold warriors that continue to dominate our foreign policy establishment.
That can lead to some very catastrophic decisions, I would argue.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
In terms of Iran, what does this mean for Iran? Because I mean, I know we were saying that some of the talk of Iranian proxies is overwrought, but this does feel like a blow in some ways to Iran nonetheless.
Certainly. I would definitely agree that the past year plus, the aftermath of October 7th, um, we've seen the ways that what Israel has done and the ways that the US has concentrated military resources in the region to back up Israel is clearly making Iran feel less secure. I do think it's interesting the ways that, so for example, we had in early April, Iran and Israel exchanging rockets. And then that happened again in early October. I was actually in Jordan when the Iranian missiles went overhead towards Israel. And yet in both of those, and then in addition to these exchange of missiles, we saw things like the attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, for example, on April 1st. And that was when, on April 13th, Iran responded just by firing missiles towards Israel. We saw, obviously, things like the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran over the summer by Israel, as well as things like the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, obviously in Lebanon in the context of Hezbollah, but the ways that Israel has both demonstrated its ability to hit Iran and to hit individuals or establishments that Iran sees as important or valuable, I think has certainly emboldened Israel, and also emboldened Americans who would like to see the US engaged in more overt strategies to try to take down the Iranian regime. I think this kind of talk is a little frightening, especially as we head into a Trump administration, which is unlikely to be constrained by some of
Yeah,
the
just look at some of those picks. Pete Hegseth, ooh.
exactly. And, we are already seeing a Middle East that has been r racked by conflict for years. You think about the lingering instability that resulted from the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the reverberations of that, um, that you continue to have Iraqi refugees you displaced around the region. The ongoing violence from, the outcomes of the 2011 Arab uprisings. Um, still Yemen, Syria, Libya, these are countries that have never recovered from the violence that resulted of those popular uprisings. And so, and now obviously in October, Israel invaded Lebanon, and now we have Israel invading Syria. And when I was in Jordan, there was some concern, what if Israel decides that it wants the East Bank as well as the West Bank? If it annexes the West Bank, which we've heard people like Smotrich saying is going to happen in 2025, the Israeli finance minister, Jordanians are starting to feel concerned. What if they keep pushing? I don't see that as particularly likely, given Jordan is a major non-NATO ally of the United States. But we, again, like I said, we have Trump coming in, and
The thing that gets me, to be honest, is, and I get the feeling that this may have been a feeling in Iran, it may have been a feeling in Egypt, it may have been a feeling in a lot of countries. I'm actually, it still blows my mind that what Israel has been doing since October 7th has been allowed and enabled. And I don't understand the calculus of it. It's just really shocking to me. And I get the feeling that this will not end well.
absolutely. I mean, this is a big part of why I resigned from the State Department, was this shock that the Biden administration and the broader US government would support what has been plausibly determined to be a genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and that this is live streamed on our phones every day, and it just continues to happen. And I think one thing that frustrates me about that is you'll hear people say things like, the world is allowing this to happen. And that's not fair to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is trying to use the UN, the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. They are trying to use these existing mechanisms to stop Israel, to pursue accountability. And yet the US has blocked those efforts at every turn. So it's not that the rest of the world is letting this happen. They're trying to use these mechanisms and institutions in compliance with international law, as the US has frequently berated other countries. We need to uphold the rules-based international order. We need to, and I should clarify there the distinction between rules-based international order, which doesn't actually mean international law. It's more sort of like how whatever rules the US decides are worth upholding,
Well, you even see it
contracts
in
to.
I was going to say, you even see it in these op-eds now saying, well, the ICC can't be going after Israel. That's meant for African countries and Russia. They should only go after those. And it's kind of
Right.
out in the open now how certain
Yeah,
people think
no,
about this.
absolutely. Absolutely. And for me, not only is this horrifying in terms of the effect that it's having on Palestinians in Gaza, but for the future of the international system, when you have again, and it's not just the Trump administration, it's the Biden administration, which came in pledging to uphold the US role in the world and America's support for international institutions and, rejoining the UN Human Rights Council and the Paris Climate Accords. All of this rhetoric about America as the indispensable nation and needing to uphold this, post-World War II international order, and how they have trampled all over it and just made it just so shockingly apparent that it is only, do as I do, not as, or do as I say, not as I do, or we're only going to uphold these rules when we want to, when it serves what we see as being in the interests of the US or, you know, so far the only other country it has done this for is Israel. And I do think that that is a result of the role that Israel plays in our domestic politics. I do think it reflects Biden himself as a self-described, deeply committed Zionist. Um, I do think that this is going to change over time, and we're seeing a generational shift here. But unfortunately, it is not happening fast enough to save lives in Gaza.
Do you think other countries are taking note of this and sort of thinking, well, if Israel can do this, then maybe we could do this? I mean, and even before Gaza, I mean, we had the whole issue with the crisis with Nagorno-Karabakh, and Biden didn't really step in there. I'm not sure they could have, but I feel like we're going to see more of this regional instability and even land grabs by certain countries. Do you think that's a concern going forward?
Absolutely. And I think the Nagorno-Karabakh parallel is certainly instructive. And you think about the ways that we saw very few members of the foreign policy establishment calling out what Azerbaijan was doing to Armenians in that region. Um, the US continuing to provide weapons to Azerbaijan, just really not much recognition at all of a land grab and an effort to blockade and starve a civilian population, very similar to what Israel is doing and has been doing to Gaza for 18 years at this point. Um, so yes, I'm very concerned that given that respect for international law or respect for human rights has been treated by the United States as only applicable when the US says it's applicable, is undermining the broader legitimacy of these structures and these concepts. At the same time, a human rights lawyer pointed out recently that this past year, in the aftermath of October 7th, you've heard a lot more attention paid to institutions like the ICC, the ICJ, questions of like, well, what would the Geneva Conventions allow here? Like, what exactly, what does international law say on these issues? And so, from her perspective, it is making these institutions and laws more salient and reiterating that there is a desire for them to exist, a need for them, the need to improve them, to strengthen them. So again, it's too little, too late, but I found that point to offer at least some cold comfort.
Before we close out, I just wanted to say the thing that really gets me is I feel like with previous administrations, there were red lines that you weren't going to cross. I mean, even Reagan stepped in and told Israel, you can't do this. You need to stop the bombing. I would even argue that George W. Bush had red lines with Israel. And it seems like, I don't know if this is a correct assessment on my part. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like something has changed, especially since the Abraham Accords. And, I feel like there's been a continuation with regards to Middle East policy since the Abraham Accords that was not the same as what came before it. What do you make of that? Because
No,
I don't understand how I just thought that, like previous administrations, this administration would have done something by now.
yeah. No, I agree with you that the Abraham Accords were a watershed moment in demonstrating to both Israel and members of the US government that there were countries in the region that were willing to ignore their own populations' desires to continue to advocate for a state of Palestine and would normalize with Israel with no conditions, for Palestinians. And we know that the Biden administration very much wanted to pursue that model and one up the Trump administration and achieve Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia, and were willing to give the Saudis so much in exchange, a civilian nuclear program, an open-ended security commitment from the US military, which the concern there would have been the moral hazard of once you've committed the US military to defending Saudi Arabia, what sorts of crazy behaviors might we be likely to see? We know MBS invaded Yemen in 2015 under the mistaken impression that it would be easy and quick to oust the Houthis from Sana'a. And 7 years later, there was finally a truce declared, and subsequently we have seen MBS learn the hard way that the Houthis could actually hit him, hit Riyadh and hit Jeddah and threaten Vision 2030, which as a result is why we've seen the Saudis now actually arguing to constrain the US when the US is trying to contain efforts by the Houthis to impose a blockade on the Red Sea and the Israeli port of Eilat. So now the tables have turned in terms of MBS wanting to not piss off the Houthis too much. But the concern being that if MBS had an open-ended security guarantee, he would go back to these same sorts of policies like the invasion of Yemen. What might Saudi feel emboldened to do vis-a-vis Iran? Whereas at the moment, and for the past few years, we have seen Iran and Saudi Arabia being willing to cool down the tensions. Again,
Yeah, and I think China has been a part of that as well. Yeah.
China has been a part of that, although I think it's important to give the Omanis credit. When we saw the Iran-Saudi normalization deal that was signed in Beijing, that was mostly just an opportunity for China to take some credit for back channel efforts that the Omanis, to my understanding, had been very involved in sort of fostering that. But it's true that the Chinese are interested in being seen as actors for peace and stability in the region, in contrast to the way that the United States continues to be seen by much of the world as selling massive amounts of weapons, which is true, and sort of facilitating violence, whether it's carried out by the US military or by the Israeli military. I have came away from a recent workshop with others where the takeaway was that we hoped that the Gulf actors, the Gulf leaders, would serve as some kind of restraint on Trump's worst impulses in the region. That knowing that the Trump family has relations with Mohammed bin Salman and with Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, that they would have the ear of the Trump administration in saying, maybe it's not actually a good idea to launch, military actions against Iran, for example, because that would be very detrimental to efforts by Saudi Arabia and the UAE to build up their economies, to try to recover from the ways that conflict in the region has undermined their efforts at economic development. And I'm speaking here specifically about Saudi Arabia. The UAE is quite economically developed, and now Saudi is trying to catch up to the ways that the UAE has managed to establish itself as a bastion for investment, for financial institutions, for tourism, and MBS is trying to have Saudi Arabia play more of that role.
With regards to the Abraham Accords, I feel like the logic of it is very backwards because I've talked to people that are supportive of it, and they'll say, well, first you normalize between these Arab countries and these the Gulf countries and Israel, and then the Palestine issue will fall into place after that. And I think that's completely insane. I don't understand how everything is just going to fall into place. What do you make of what's the logic that drives support for the Abraham Accords?
I certainly agree with you that there's this flawed logic that you just need these other countries to normalize with Israel. I mean, I don't know if maybe the thinking goes that then Israel would feel secure enough to establish a state of Palestine. I think that may have been how it is sometimes justified because the
No, I
US
think that yeah, I think that is part of the thinking. But go on.
because the US always prioritizes Israeli security over the security and the rights of Palestinians, that I think that is likely to be, and then on top of that, you have the fact that stated US policy has remained a two-state solution, despite the fact that obviously the numbers of Israeli settlers in the West Bank has grown exponentially, and at this point, there is really no viable way to establish a state of Palestine. And so, many academics and experts have concluded that at this point, there's really only the possibility of a one-state solution. And it's a question of, does that look like an apartheid state where, Palestinians have second-class citizenship and no rights
I
and
would argue that's in a weird way that's kind of I mean, it's a one state reality now is what I always tell
it's a
people.
one
Yeah.
state reality now. I think those who try to bring any measure of optimism would argue that it would have to be a one state reality where Palestinians do have rights. And then, the concern from many would be that it would no longer then be a Jewish state. Um, and, I think when you hear from members of this right-wing Israeli government, their solution is a one-state reality. You annex the West Bank, and Palestinians either have to give up their aspirations of Palestinian nationhood and accept living without rights in Israeli society, or they will be expelled, or they will be killed. And unfortunately, this is this is not limited to the right wing in Israel. My understanding is that this is increasingly the view held by many Israelis. Um, and this is partly the result of the fact that the United States has not imposed any conditions on Israel, not prior to October 7th, but especially since October 7th, to say, look, we're only going to continue to support you if you actually make progress on addressing the issue, addressing the fact that Palestinians do not have rights. Again, whether it ends up looking like a two-state solution or a one-state solution, but that there you're only going to get American support if you move towards resolving this in a way that
Well, yeah,
allows.
because not to interrupt you, but if Israel isn't going to address, a solution, a diplomatic solution, whether it's two state, one state, whatever, they're essentially saying, well, we already have one state. We're going to control everything from the river to the sea, and the Palestinians just have to deal with that. But then, if that's the case, Palestine that's a policing problem for Israel. Then is what they're saying, which means why do we American taxpayers have to fund you? It's your problem, not ours.
I mean, that's been the question for a long time. Why does the United States continue to provide all this support? Obviously, the appointment of Mike Huckabee as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who himself is a committed Christian Zionist and evangelical. So,
I'm
the sort
assuming you saw his whole thing about there is no. I think it was he said there is no West Bank, only Judea and Samaria.
Yes. Well, and then Tom Cotton also wanting to introduce legislation to say that the U.S. shouldn't refer to it as the West Bank anymore. Um,
Bill Clinton had a speech like that too recently. I don't know if you saw that.
I saw some nonsense
Or
Clinton did.
he said Judea and Samaria rather than West Bank. But anyways, I'm getting far afield. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, and his, self-serving fiction that they could have, it was Arafat's fault that they didn't resolve the conflict when, the choice Arafat was presented with was not something he could have brought back to his people. And
Right.
and lived or stayed, kept his position. It wouldn't have worked, I guess. Um, yeah, I mean, the circumstances are about to get worse because, for example, the fact that the Knesset just passed the law that will go into effect in the dead of winter in January, that UNRWA is no longer permitted to operate in the Palestinian territories, which has been responsible for the majority of aid getting into Gaza. Obviously, there are a lot of humanitarian groups being involved, but UNRWA is the organization with the resources on the ground to distribute what little aid has been able to get in at all. And so if UNRWA is no longer able to operate, even the tiny amount of aid that Israel allowed in is that's going to become impossible. And there is no possibility of setting up a replacement, especially in the context of ongoing war and bombardment. Um, and all the implications this will also have for the population of 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, who also have long depended on UNRWA for just basic services for health and education, and it's the I think maybe because the United States again has continued to enable all of Israel's worst impulses, um, Israel may be suddenly faced with a situation where it cannot contain the results of its violence and what it has done to the Palestinians. Because again, this is not like the United States bombing Afghans or Iraqis. I mean, Palestinians live next to Israelis. And for all that Israel tries to set up Bantustans and prevent contact between Palestinians and Israelis, they can't escape the fact that there's this population next to and among them. And Israeli security cannot be guaranteed without providing for the security and rights for Palestinians. And the longer the US props up the Israeli fiction that it doesn't have to address that issue, the more of a disservice the US is doing to Israelis, to Americans for whom, the interests of Israel are paramount, which is not me. But for those people, I would say you're not actually helping Israel here.
In the
Um,
long term, this is going to. I think what you're saying is the kind of hubris we're seeing with Israel's actions usually have a consequence. We may not see it right away, but eventually, this could all very well come back to haunt Israel.
exactly, exactly. And haunt the United States because the US is so committed, like I said, with in terms of the military buildup in the region, in terms of the ways that both the Biden administration and I anticipate the Trump administration have committed themselves. And the US could get dragged into yet another unnecessary war in the Middle East, which is the last thing most Americans say they want.
In closing, what are your biggest concerns going forward with regards to just the region, the Middle East, and also with regards to a Trump presidency?
I mean, my
I know
big
that's a bit of a two-parter. My apologies.
my big concerns at the moment are the appointments that Trump has been making, the extremely pro-Israel people that he is staffing his administration with. I'm worried about the fact that Israel is likely to take this as a green light to annex the West Bank and the implications this will have regionally, the way that this could, again, bog the United States into another unnecessary war in the Middle East. Um, I do think the situation in Syria is concerning. And excuse me, I hope the the Trump administration not will be willing to engage with whichever government comes about in Syria, and by so doing, hopefully encourage them to behave in a more inclusive manner, and to try to provide for all Syrian citizens. Um, You know, I think when I was in Jordan, it was before the election, and you had so many people asking me, what explains why the Biden administration has done what they've done? And I would try to, just talk about how this is such an important domestic issue in the United States. And, Biden himself is extremely old and has a very outdated understanding of what Israel is. And and the takeaway would always be, things are bad, but they can get worse. And Jordanians certainly recognize that. And so while things obviously look very bad in the region right now, I am worried about the ways that they could get worse. And it's
Do you
not to
think
say,
everything well, go on, I'm sorry.
well, I just wanted to say, I don't know that a Harris administration would have necessarily been much better, is what's so depressing. I mean, my hope is that you might have seen a President Harris who was no longer vice president to Biden, feeling empowered to say, we're going to start conditioning military assistance to Israel because this is not in U.S. interests, to facilitate a genocide. But I don't know. She and her campaign had given very few signals that that would be the case. And again, so many of U.S. impulses towards the Middle East have been misguided over the past several decades and only contributed to more instability and more violence. So again, while I'm worried about Trump, that's not to say that I feel like everything would have been somehow better under a Harris administration.
Well, we'll leave it at that. Hopefully, we can have another conversation at a better time when things are less chaotic. But thank you so much, Dr. Sheline.
I wouldn't hold my breath for less chaos, but maybe things will become a little more clear, at least in Syria.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.